It was a sweltering Tuesday morning in late July when James Holloway, the newly appointed police chief of Brookdale, a quiet town on the outskirts of Austin, Texas, stepped out of his dusty Ford pickup. Dressed in a faded plaid shirt, worn-out jeans, and a pair of beat-up work boots, he looked nothing like a man who had spent over 20 years working his way up in law enforcement. And that was exactly the point. James had no interest in grand introductions or choreographed welcomes. He believed in seeing people as they truly were, not how they wanted to be seen when the boss was watching. As a black man stepping into a department with a reputation for questionable conduct, he knew he had to assess the culture firsthand. What better way to do that than by walking in as just another nobody? The precinct's parking lot hummed with the routine chaos of a shift change. Officers swapped stories by their squad cars, grabbing coffee from a beat-up vending truck, laughter mixing with the hum of idling engines. James scanned the scene, catching snippets of conversation. A few officers glanced his way, dismissing him as just another local. No one seemed to recognize him, which made sense. His appointment had only been announced 3 days ago, and he had deliberately kept his arrival under wraps. The formal introduction would come later that morning, but before that, he wanted to see the real department, the one they didn't put on display for press conferences and photo ops, and he didn't have to wait long. James adjusted the brim of his Texas Longhorns baseball cap and took a steadying breath. The weight of his mission to root out the rot festering within Brookdale PD settled heavy on his shoulders. He had faced resistance before, but something told him this job would push him in ways he hadn't yet imagined. As he stepped toward the precinct, a burst of laughter drifted through the humid air. James entered through the side door, blending into the background as officers swapped stories, paperwork stacked high on cluttered desks. The harsh glow of fluorescent lights reflected off scuffed tile floors, and the bitter scent of stale coffee lingered in the air. He moved slowly, absorbing everything, the way officers congregated in tight-knit circles, the sidelong glances, the quiet power dynamics at play. No one paid him much mind. Not until he paused near the break room. "Hey, you." A sharp voice cut through the noise. James turned. A white officer pushed off from a nearby desk, making his way over with a slow, deliberate swagger, his badge read Officer Landry. Behind him, a few others leaned against the wall, their arms crossed, watching with curiosity. James opened his mouth to respond, but Landry didn't give him the chance. "You lost or something?" Landry drawled, his smirk widening. "This ain't a shelter. If you're looking for a handout, try a few blocks over." James stilled. The words hit like a brick to the chest. A dozen different reactions fought for control: anger, disbelief, amusement. He could shut this down right now, let them know exactly who he was. But that would ruin the point of this little experiment. Before he could decide his next move, Landry took another step forward, raising his voice just enough for the others to hear. "Didn't you hear me? Get the hell out of here. We don't need people like you hanging around." Laughter rippled through the group. James clenched his jaw, his heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. He started to respond, but before he could get a word out, Landry stepped closer, his face just inches away. Then, without warning, he spit. A warm glob of saliva struck James's cheek. For a moment, the room fell into eerie silence. Then the laughter erupted louder, more vicious than before. One officer slapped a desk, doubling over, while another muttered something under his breath about putting people in their place. James stood still, his mind raced. He could feel the heat of his pulse in his ears, the sting of humiliation creeping up his spine. Every instinct told him to react, to put Landry in his place right then and there. But that wasn't why he was here. Instead, he took a slow breath and reached into his pocket. Pulling out a neatly folded handkerchief, he wiped his face, his movements calm, deliberate. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" he asked, his voice even and controlled. Landry smirked. "Only the ones who don't belong." The room erupted in laughter again, but James didn't say another word. He simply turned on his heel and walked away down the hallway, past the rows of desks, past the men who had no idea what was coming. Then the intercom crackled to life. "All personnel, report to the briefing room immediately." It was time. The briefing room buzzed with activity. Officers filed in, some clutching steaming coffee mugs, others sharing inside jokes. James entered through a side door, now holding a folder embossed with the precinct's official seal. From his hidden vantage point, he watched as familiar faces filled the room, some still laughing from what had just happened. At the front, Captain Roy Beckett, a grizzled man with a thick, graying mustache, cleared his throat and called for order. "All right, settle down, folks. We've got an important introduction today." The chatter died down. Officers straightened in their seats, some exchanging curious glances. Leaning against the wall, Landry crossed his arms, still smirking, looking like a man thoroughly enjoying his morning. At the front of the room, Captain Roy Beckett cleared his throat. "As most of you know, Chief Hargrove retired last month. We've been waiting for his replacement, and today, I'm pleased to introduce our new leader, a man with an impressive record and a vision for this department." A hush fell over the room, and then James stepped forward. His footsteps were measured, deliberate. The second he moved toward the podium, the energy in the room shifted. The officers froze, eyes widened. James set the folder down on the lectern and took his time, scanning the room, his presence commanding, his silence deafening. The smirk on Landry's face twitched, faltered, then disappeared entirely. His skin drained of color, his arms slowly dropping to his sides. Others exchanged uneasy glances, some whispering, others staring as if they had just seen a ghost. Then James finally spoke. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm, steady. "My name is James Holloway. As of today, I am your new chief of police." The room went dead silent. Landry's face flushed red. Whatever confidence he had just minutes ago vanished, replaced by the unmistakable look of a man who knew he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. James let the weight of that moment settle before continuing. "When I arrived this morning," he said, his tone even, unwavering, "I came in plain clothes because I wanted to see this department without the filter of rank and titles. What I witnessed was enlightening." A murmur spread through the crowd, nervous shifting. Some officers cast guilty glances around the room. James raised a hand, and the whispers snapped into silence. "In just a few short minutes, I've seen behaviors that are not just unprofessional but downright unacceptable." His eyes locked onto Landry, holding for a fraction longer than necessary before sweeping across the rest of the room. "Let me be perfectly clear. Whatever culture has been allowed to fester here, it ends today." The room remained eerily silent. The weight of James's words pressed down like a storm rolling in. Landry shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the floor. James took a step closer to the edge of the podium, his tone sharp but controlled. "Respect is not optional." His voice carried through the room, each syllable hitting with precision. "It is the foundation of what we do as law enforcement. Without it, we fail not just each other, but the very community we swore to serve." He let the silence hang, watching as officers shifted in their seats, avoiding his gaze. "This morning," he continued, "some of you laughed at what you thought was just another powerless man being put in his place." His words cut through the room like a blade. "Let me remind you, everyone who walks through those doors deserves respect, whether they're wearing a badge or not." Still, no one moved. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. Some officers clenched their jaws, others stole side glances at Landry, whose smirk had long since vanished. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. James let the silence linger, his gaze unwavering. Then he continued. "I understand that change is difficult," he said, his voice steady, laced with quiet authority. "But let me be absolutely clear. There will be zero tolerance for behavior that disrespects the dignity of any individual, whether they are a fellow officer, a civilian, or anyone else." He stepped down from the podium. The air grew heavier as he walked slowly toward the officers. He wasn't yelling, but his presence was enough to make them sit up straight. Then he stopped, just a few feet away from Landry. "Officer Landry." Landry flinched. His bravado from earlier had completely dissolved. James locked eyes with him, his expression unreadable. "You," he said, his voice low, deliberate, "represent everything that is broken in this department." A hush fell over the room. "When you spat in my face, it wasn't just me you disrespected." James took a step closer. "You disrespected the badge." Another step, "The oath you took." His voice hardened. "And the very people we swore to protect." Landry's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. The entire room watched, holding its breath. Landry stammered, "Chief, I didn't know." James didn't let him finish. "That's exactly the problem," he cut in, his voice sharp, unwavering. "You didn't care to know. You didn't stop to think before you acted because you assumed the man standing in front of you didn't matter." And that assumption, his eyes burned into Landry's, is exactly why this department has lost the trust of the people we swore to protect. The room stayed deathly silent. Not a single officer moved. Not a chair scraped against the floor. The weight of James's words hung heavy in the air. He shifted his gaze to the rest of the group. "What I witnessed today wasn't just one man's mistake." His voice rang through the briefing room, clear, commanding. "It's a culture. A culture where bullying, prejudice, and disrespect are not only tolerated but celebrated. And that stops right now." James stepped back toward the podium, his voice rising just enough to ensure no one missed a word. "I've spent my career fighting for justice not just out in the streets, but within the very walls of departments like this one. Change is hard. It won't happen overnight. But make no mistake," his gaze swept across the room, "as long as I am chief, this precinct will operate with integrity, respect, and accountability." A beat of silence. Then, without hesitation, James turned to Captain Beckett and gave a slight nod. "Effective immediately, Officer Landry is suspended, pending an internal investigation." A ripple of gasps spread through the room, muffled whispers, wide eyes. The kind of reaction that came when officers realized things were about to change for real. Landry's face flushed crimson, his jaw clenched, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. But he said nothing. He wouldn't dare. James, unfazed, stood tall. "This isn't about punishment," he continued, his voice firm. "This is about setting a standard. And if you're not willing to rise to it, then this isn't the place for you." His eyes scanned the room, locking with each officer's. "If you're ready to do better, to be better, then we move forward together. But make no mistake," a pause, a long, heavy pause, "I will hold you accountable every step of the way." The room was stone silent. For the first time in a long time, Brookdale PD knew what leadership felt like. The meeting ended in heavy silence. Officers shuffled out of the briefing room, their usual chatter noticeably absent. James stayed at the podium for a moment, watching as Landry stormed out, his face a tight mix of embarrassment and barely restrained anger. The other officers kept their heads down, avoiding eye contact, their expressions ranging from quiet guilt to deep contemplation. James let out a slow exhale. This was only the beginning. Years of deeply ingrained attitudes weren't going to change overnight. Some wouldn't change at all. But James hadn't come to Brookdale to make friends. He came to make a difference. Back in his office, he sank into his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. The phone on his desk rang. "Captain Beckett." James picked up. "Chief Holloway." Beckett hesitated for a beat. Then, "I just wanted to say you handled that better than most would have." James nodded, even though Beckett couldn't see him. "Appreciate that, Captain, but the real work starts now. I want a full review of Landry's record on my desk by tomorrow morning. Complaints, incident reports, everything you've got." A brief pause. "It's done," Beckett said. Then, with a little more weight in his voice, "And, Chief, I think you shook a few of them today." In a good way. James didn't respond right away. He simply hung up, allowing himself the smallest moment of satisfaction before turning his attention to the mountain of paperwork in front of him. The next few weeks were different. The precinct felt different. The same officers who had once laughed at Landry's antics now avoided him altogether. Whispers of his suspension rippled through the department. James made it a point to walk the halls daily, stopping to talk, making sure his presence was more than just a title, a reminder, a standard. Some officers took it to heart. One afternoon, Officer Melissa Reyes, a younger recruit, approached him hesitantly. She looked nervous, glancing around before speaking. "Chief, can I talk to you for a second?" James nodded. "Of course." "What's on your mind?" She took a breath. "I was part of the problem." James said nothing, letting her find her words. "I laughed at Landry's jokes. I stood by while things happened that I knew weren't right. I didn't speak up because I was scared of retaliation." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "But I don't want to be that kind of cop. I want to do better, Chief. That's all I ask," James replied, his voice firm but understanding. "Change starts with you." Officer Reyes gave a small nod, determination flickering in her eyes. But James knew not everyone was willing to change. Landry filed an appeal against his suspension, claiming unfair treatment. James held his ground. Accountability wasn't optional, not anymore. When the department's internal review was completed, it revealed a string of past complaints against Landry: excessive force, inappropriate comments, a pattern of misconduct that had been ignored for years. His appeal was denied. James made one thing crystal clear. The days of sweeping bad behavior under the rug were over. Progress was slow, but it was happening. Conversations about implicit bias, de-escalation tactics, and community relations were met with mixed reactions. Some officers welcomed the change, others resisted. James didn't let that deter him, because every small victory mattered. A recruit speaking up, an officer rethinking their approach. A step forward, no matter how small, was still a step in the right direction. One morning, James attended a community outreach event. Kids played in the park, volunteers handed out food and school supplies, and officers mingled with the crowd, something that hadn't happened much before. As James stood near a booth, a young boy, no older than 8, hesitantly approached him. His eyes were wide, filled with curiosity and a bit of hesitation. "Are you really the chief?" the boy asked. James smiled. "I am." The boy hesitated before looking down at his shoes. "My dad says the police don't care about us." James felt that sentence like a punch to the gut. He crouched down, meeting the boy's gaze. "I can't change the past," he said gently, "but I promise you we're working to do better." The boy studied him for a moment. "And if you ever need help," James added, "you come find me, okay?" A beat of silence. Then a small smile broke across the boy's face. And just like that, James was reminded why he had taken this job in the first place. By the end of his first year, the precinct was far from perfect, but it was undeniably different. The officers who couldn't adapt, they were gone, replaced by new recruits, officers who believed in the same vision James did. The community, once skeptical, was beginning to see signs of real change. Trust was being rebuilt. The divide, slowly but surely, was beginning to close, and James knew this was just the beginning. That evening, he stood in the precinct's main hallway, arms crossed, watching as officers wrapped up their shifts. Laughter and conversation filled the space around him, but this time, it was different. Not forced, not laced with cruelty, just real, honest, right? James took a slow breath, letting the moment settle. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, setbacks, days that made him question if any of this was worth it. But for the first time, he believed it was. Because real change doesn't come easy, but it's always worth the fight. And as long as he stood in this precinct, in this town wearing this badge, he was going to make damn sure that change lasted.